Good morning. So I want to tell you the rather strange and generally unknown story of how an American founding father influenced the modern revitalization of Jewish life in the 19th century, 6,000 miles away in Eastern Europe. Dr. Benjamin Franklin, as we know, 1706 to 1790, was a Renaissance man, was so successful in many different fields, including science, printing, diplomat. He was really a son of the Enlightenment. As we also probably know, famously, as a young man, he had not followed a straight moral path, which will be part of our story. He had a common law wife and he had an illegitimate son from another liaison. But what I want to mention at this point is that he was a well-known Freemason. From 1730 in Philadelphia, he was Grand Master of the Philadelphia Lodge in 1734. And when he went to Paris in 1776, he joined the Neuf Sœurs, the Nine Sisters Lodge in Paris, where he famously sponsored the admittance of Voltaire to the group. When he returned to Philadelphia in 1785, he became the Grand Master of the St. John's Lodge in Philadelphia. So he was well known as a Freemason, and it was very much part of his decision to work with others of the fraternity for a moral improvement and for social action in the communities in which he resided. He wrote an autobiography, which he called his memoir, and he dedicated this memoir to his son, supposedly as a way to influence him in how to lead a better life than he had led as a young man. The memoir was written in 4 different stages, different times of his life, and was published actually in different parts. He first started writing it in 1760 when he was in his 60s, but then he put it aside and didn't continue it. It was actually in his house in Philadelphia when the British requisitioned his house in 1777, and the autobiography was thrown out of the house into the street. By chance, it was found by somebody who kept it and returned it to Franklin later on after the Revolution. Franklin wrote more in his autobiography until 1788, and then he died in 1790 at the age of 84. But the first part of the autobiography was actually published in French in 1791, and this is, in fact, the picture you see is from the 1791 publication. It predates the English version, so people were reading it in French before it was published in English. It was very popular. It's considered one of the best-known autobiographies written to date. And part 2 of the autobiography unusually has a special section dedicated to moral development and the personal growth of the character of Benjamin Franklin. He writes in his memoir, "It was about this time that I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. I wished to live without committing any faults at any time. I would conquer all that natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into." As you can see, he's definitely moving away from his youth. "As I knew or thought I knew what was right and wrong, I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other. But I soon found that I had undertaken a task of more difficulty than I had imagined. While my care was employed in guarding against one fault, I was often surprised by another. Habit took the advantage of inattention. Inclination was sometimes too strong for reason. I concluded at length that the mere speculative conviction that it was our interest to be completely virtuous was not sufficient to protect our slipping, and the contrary habits must be broken and good ones acquired and established before we can have any dependence on a steady, uniform rectitude of conduct. For this purpose, I therefore contrived the following method." So this was a method that he contrived in order to be able to develop his moral character. He comes up with 13 attributes or values that were important to him as he was seeking to become a more fully developed human being. He was very interested in the notion of 13 virtues or dispositions. He gives each one a name and then a brief description next to the name. So for instance, we have first temperance, eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. And for tranquility, number 11, we have be not disturbed at trifles or at accidents common or unavoidable. And for humility, imitate Jesus and Socrates. Benjamin Franklin had, from the earliest times, been involved with groups of particularly men who were reading moral philosophy together. In 1727, he created the Junto Society, where these men would work together on moral philosophy and ethical development. He wants to see how he could live without committing any fault and to conquer all natural inclination. But he did find it hard, as he says himself, and reading was not enough, so he needed a method. So each of these dispositions or values, virtues, were important in his work to try and create a method for moral improvement. He starts with temperance because he believes that's the beginning of the way in which one should think about moral improvement, and then moves to silence. So each of these was in an order of his making that he felt one followed from the other. He particularly was interested in acquiring positive habits and overcoming undesirable ones. My intention being to acquire the habitude of all these virtues, I judged it would be well not to distract my attention by attempting the whole at once, but to fix it on one of them at a time. And when I should be master of that, then proceed to another, and so on, until I should have got through all the 13. And as the previous acquisition of some might facilitate the acquisition of certain others, I arranged them with that view as they stand above. Conceiving then agreeably to the advice of Pythagoras in his golden verses, daily examination would be necessary, I contrived the following method for conducting that examination. I made a little book, in which I allotted a page for each of the virtues. I ruled each page with red ink, so as to have 7 columns, one for each day of the week, marking each column with a letter for the day. I crossed these columns with 13 red lines, marking the beginning of each line with the first letter of one of the virtues, on which line and its proper column I might mark by a little black spot each fault that I found upon examination to being committed respecting the virtue upon that day. So it was very well organized. He was dealing with one of these 13 virtues at a time, and that he was marking each day with a dot that would say that there was a breach of that particular virtue. And he created a chart, which is actually published in the autobiography. This is the chart for temperance. As you can see, has the name at the top, then it has the description of the 2-line description. Along the top, you have Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then down here, temperance, silence, order, and all of the ones down here. And then you have a final column for totaling at the bottom. So you can total all your black marks. Here's your black marks. You would work on one per day, per week, in fact, which we'll see in a minute. So he describes how to use it. I determined to give a week's strict attention to each of the virtues successively. Thus, in the first week, my great guard was to avoid even the least offense against temperance, leaving the other virtues to their ordinary chance, only marking every evening the faults of that day around temperance. Thus, if in the first week I could keep my first line marked T for temperance, clear of spots, I suppose the habit of that virtue so much strengthened and its opposite weakened that I might venture extending my attention to include the next, and for the following week keep both lines clear of spots. Preceding this to the last, I could go through a course in 13 weeks and 4 courses in a year. So he would do this for 13 weeks at a time with each of the 13 virtues, and then he would take a break, and then he would start all over again. And he could do that 4 times in a year. He talks about what it's like then in terms of weeding out the bad things. And I hope by encouraging the pleasure of seeing on my pages the progress I made in virtue, by clearing successfully the lines of their spots, till in the end, by a number of courses, I should be happy in viewing a clean book after 13 weeks daily examination. So the idea was then to not to have any spots left at the end of the time. He was surprised that he found himself so much fuller of faults than he wished. But he did feel that over time it worked for him. However, in the end, he let the system lapse. He didn't carry on doing this on a regular basis over the rest of his life. Remember, this was already being published by 1791. But he did keep the book in his pocket. So at least the book was there, if not the system. Now, as we know, Benjamin Franklin was not avidly or outwardly explicitly Christian or religious, but he did feel that this scheme was not wholly without religion. As a deist and as someone who was sympathetic to all religions, he felt that there was a possibility of seeing this in a religious light. I had purposely, there was in it no mark of any distinguishing tenet of any particular sect, but I had purposely avoided that, for being fully persuaded of the utility and excellence of my method, it might be serviceable to people in all religions, and that intending some time or other to publish it, I would not have anything in it that should prejudice anyone of any sect against it. I purposed writing a little comment on each virtue in which I would have shown the advantages of possessing it and the mischiefs attending its opposite vice. I should have called my book The Art of Virtue, because it would have shown the means and manner of obtaining virtue, which would have distinguished it from the mere exhortation to be good that does not instruct and indicate the means. But it is like the apostle's man of verbal charity, who only without showing to the naked and hungry how or where they might get clothes, exhorted them to be fed and clothed. So he was very much interested in how this could actually happen, and that this could be something that could be a humanitarian and universal method for others to have. And we do know that others did take up this method. We know that Leo Tolstoy had a Franklin booklet in his pocket, and he used the method as well. He wrote near the end of his life, "If I could conceive that I could overcome pride in my achievements, then I would be pleased. But then I would be proud of my humility, which would be another fault to beat down." But he was obviously pleased enough with the system that he included it in his autobiography, and particularly for his son, but also for others, and indeed us, to learn about. And it is in fact used today. You can go on to the Benjamin Franklin website, and you can find this method, and these Benjamin Franklin circles continue today. And now we're going to go to a completely different part of the world. This is a map of Europe. Particularly, we're looking up here at this area, Northeast Europe, which today would be around Poland, Lithuania, and in its time has been different parts, has been owned by different parts in different countries. In this particular area, in this time period, throughout Europe, we have about 2 million Jews who are living, of which 1.25 were living in this area here. Heavily dense Jewish population in this part of Poland. Of 1 in every 2 inhabitants of a Polish city or town was Jewish. And there were many Jews who were living in the rural areas as well. It was an impoverished community. They were living in poverty, and they had been barred from many of the crafts and agricultural work that was permitted to other peasants in Poland. So they were therefore relegated to the trades that were really serving their own population, like tailoring, but they were also involved in alcohol distribution and tax collecting, which of course was not a very popular position to have in Poland at the time. They were Yiddish speaking, that is the language of Eastern Europe, which is a form of German and Hebrew together. And they were pretty much unlearned in terms of any kind of Western education, although many of them did have a Hebrew and a Bible education. They had been completely untouched by the Enlightenment, by the 1800s. It was very much, Poland was still a feudal society with peasants and aristocrats. And of course, there was a lot of repression, persecution, pogroms, and of course superstition that was held by the Christian church and that was being spread amongst the population against the Jewish population. This is the environment in which I now want to talk about a book that was published in 1808. This book was published in Hebrew. It's called Cheshbon HaNefesh, or in English, Accounting of the Soul. It was published by a rabbi, Rabbi Mendel of Satanov, Lefin. Here you'll see the name Cheshbon HaNefesh in Hebrew. Here you'll see his name Mendel, his first name, his father's name. Here in English, Menachem Mendel Lefin, born 1749, died 1826. We have no picture of Menachem Mendel, Rabbi Lefin. He was a rabbinic scholar, but due to his intensive studies and the environment in which he was studying, he had a problem with his eyes, with his vision, and so he went to Berlin in 1780 for 4 years to receive eye treatment. In Berlin, he learned German and French and came into contact with a group of Jewish intellectuals under the leadership of Moses Mendelssohn, who had new ideas about Jewish community life in Europe. They wished to create the conditions for an end to Jewish isolation in Jewish life, as was very present in Poland. They spread new ideas about the Enlightenment to the Jewish community, including the importance of learning Western ideas, learning the languages of the countries in which Jews lived, and changing their dress and some of their religious behaviors in order to assimilate into European life. They also felt that working through trade, through economics, was very important for Jews to take on, and that this must be a part of the future of the amelioration of the Jewish condition in Eastern Europe. They hoped that all of that would be an impetus for European society, particularly Christian society, to accept Jews as full citizens with rights in each of their countries. This, of course, took a long time, was staggered over different countries, over different periods, but of course it started first in France under the French Revolution, with Napoleon granting full citizenship to all Jews in France and all of the countries associated with France at the time. So Rabbi Lefin, who had been in Berlin, learned about these new ideas. He went back to the Ukraine, to Poland and the Ukraine in 1784, and he worked to bring these ideas back to Eastern Europe. He was one of a few who was involved in this work, and in order to try and change the attitudes in Eastern Europe, he began to translate books of natural science and medicine into Hebrew so that the masses could read and understand them and start taking them on board. Now, in that part of the country, that part of the land, of the world that we looked at before, Eastern Europe, in Poland, the situation was so dire amongst the Jewish community that a charismatic religious movement had taken a foot and had become very strong in that part of the world. It was called Hasidism. You may know of it today. Hasidism emerged in the 1740s in that part of the world. At the same time, of course, as we think of the Great Awakening of new religious, charismatic religions across Europe and, of course, North America. So that had taken foot in this part of the world, and Rabbi Lefin was very much against it. He felt that this Hasidism movement was asking people to look towards their spiritual and religious ecstasy as a means out of their poverty, rather than thinking of rationalism and modern European civilization as a means to get out of the situation they were in. So in many ways, Rabbi Lefin was both fighting against the attitudes within the Jewish community that he was working for. That was both the Hasidic attitudes and also the attitudes that were keeping Jews in isolation, that was being exercised both by those non-Jews in those lands as well as the Jewish community themselves. He therefore wanted young people, Jewish young people, to understand what was right, what was wrong, what was the right path to work on, and how to develop oneself. So he created this book, Cheshbon HaNefesh, Accounting of the Soul, in order as a means to educate young Jewish people in his community about self-improvement. It was hugely successful. It was endorsed by all of the local and national rabbis, and it was a bestseller. And it became very important in that part of the world, and it still continues to be published. And this is the kind of the type of copy you can buy these days in any kind of Jewish bookstore or in Israel. This is the paragraph from Cheshbon HaNefesh that begins to introduce us to his method. A few years ago, a new strategy was developed, a strategy that is a wonderful innovation in this field of Cheshbon HaNefesh, accounting of the soul. It would seem that the method will spread quickly, like the invention of the printing press, which brought light to the world. This strategy ties together the four elements which we talked about: balancing one person's ledgers before retiring and upon awakening, conditioning, and Cheshbon HaNefesh, accounting of the soul. However, it spares the person much of the effort that these elements required when utilized alone, as well as being more effective. Instead of taking up all of a person's time, this method actually leaves the entire day open and orderly, with the mind clear for the divine service. It clears the path so that a person can make his accounting, tempers the fires of Mussar, which is personal growth and living the good life, and facilitates character development. Moreover, the process of becoming accustomed to follow this method is sweetened by the knowledge, by their acting according to it, one lessens the amount of sin of which one is guilty. On the left-hand side, you see a chart from Benjamin Franklin, as we saw before. On the right-hand side, in Hebrew, you see the chart that Rabbi Mendel published in his book, Cheshbon HaNefesh. We see here, on top, Shavua Aleph, the first day of the week, Menuchat HaNefesh, which is the virtue of tranquility, which is the one that Benjamin Franklin lists as number 12. Here you have a two-line description, which is the same in Hebrew, the same two lines that Benjamin Franklin wrote. Here you have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, the letters of the alphabet, which represent the days of the week. So this is Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Down here you have the virtues, Menucha at the top. We'll look at these in English in a minute. Savlanut, Seder. So these are the different virtues, and there are 13 of them going down the list here. So as you can see already, this method was beginning to draw upon Benjamin Franklin's methodology and was now being used in Hebrew in a completely different part of the world for a completely different population. So here you'll see on the left Benjamin Franklin's virtues. Here you'll see the ones that are listed in Cheshbon HaNefesh by Rabbi Lefin. You'll see that he's changed the order so that we start with Menuchat HaNefesh. This is number 11 in Benjamin Franklin's list. The reason why he's changed the order is that these are in alphabetical order according to the Hebrew letters. So this is kind of a Hebrew alphabetical list, whereas Benjamin Franklin's was a list that he thought personally one followed after the other. On the right-hand side, about 50 years later, in 1850, another rabbi, Rabbi Israel Salanta, took this list of Benjamin Lefin, made his own list, which pretty much equates to Lefin's list, and that became the reason why this became so famous in Jewish life. And Rabbi Salanta was the founder of a methodology called Mussar. Mussar is very well known today as a means of moral improvement and has a huge literature ascribed to it, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. So you can see here that of the 13 dispositions of Benjamin Franklin, Lefin uses 11, but he changes 2. He takes out temperance and moderation, but he adds 2 others, patience and calmness. And so we're still working with 11 altogether. As you can see earlier,
maybe I just haven't keeping up. Were those 2 charts that you showed that combined showed Franklin's and was that coincidental, or was that created
I think Rabbi Lefin created his own chart, but he borrowed it from Benjamin Franklin and had seen the autobiography and obviously seen the chart, and the chart. Both authors use a chart in both books. Yeah. So as we heard earlier, Rabbi Lefin didn't himself ascribe this method to Benjamin Franklin. He just said that a method has been devised. However, later on, one of his students, Samuel Jacob Bick, did describe this technique as invented by the sage Benjamin Franklin from the city of Philadelphia in North America. This scholar is renowned in all corners of the earth. Thus, Rabbi Mendel Lefin has prepared a delicacy for his nation and taught a simple and clear solution for the broken but still precious soul to speedily return from the bad to the good. In their approbation, the rabbis of the generation said that this thing is beneficial and new. So Rabbi Lefin himself was not prepared to admit that he had borrowed this work from Benjamin Franklin, and some of the reasons have been analyzed for this. Perhaps he knew that a Gentile writing for a Jewish audience would not be best accepted, particularly at the time when he was working within a Jewish community that was feeling persecuted by a Christian majority. It also has been thought that perhaps in a monarchy like Poland, with a very strict authoritarian regime, quoting a Republican might not be such a good idea. So there are a number of different reasons why Rabbi Lefin himself might have not included this connection, but we can see pretty much that the same idea pertains to Rabbi Lefin's work as Benjamin Franklin had originally written. In fact, today, even in the book that's published, it does not say that this comes from Benjamin Franklin. It says that this is a method specifically written for the Jewish community. So this kind of open secret is continuing to this very day. So the question now is, how did Rabbi Lefin get hold of this idea from Benjamin Franklin? So I've been trying to do some research and investigation as to how this connection might have taken place. And I think it's connected to this woman. This woman, Isabella Czartoryska, is a Polish princess. She and her son traveled to Berlin in the 1780s, and she met the intelligentsia, particularly people like Moses Mendelssohn, who I mentioned before, and others, around the ideas of the Enlightenment, and particularly also the Jewish Enlightenment. She was a very powerful woman. She had a salon of her own intellectuals who met with her in her Polish palace. She brought together the kind of the finest and brightest minds of Poland, as Poland itself was trying to become more of a modern European state. And she was married, but in fact was a free woman in an open marriage. Her son, who was actually illegitimate, was born of the Russian ambassador and her liaison. So she was somewhat independent-minded, free-spirited woman of the time, and traveling across Europe also would have been something that wouldn't have been particularly something common in those times. Rabbi Lefin actually dedicated one of his other books to her on the occasion of her birthday in 1794. So we know that they knew each other. We imagine that they did meet, and that one of the reasons for him going back to Poland, having been in Berlin, was possibly in order to go back to work for her, because she became the tutor to her son. Sorry, he became the tutor to her son, and he worked in the Polish prince's household for that period afterwards. So she was married to Adam Czartoryski. He was very important in the new democratic Poland that was emerging, and he was also an enlightened figure. and he was a Freemason. Not only that, he was a member of the Mussar, the lodge in Paris, of which Benjamin Franklin was also a member. He was very involved with the Polish Enlightenment, and he became the first minister of education, in fact, throughout the whole of Europe in Poland. He and his wife, as I said, employed Rabbi Lefin to tutor their son, and the connection between both the two of them and the Freemason movement prompts us to think about how this connection was made. It also prompts us to think about where did Benjamin Franklin get the 13 virtues from as well. We have mentioned the Freemasons a number of times, and it's true to say that, particularly in North America, the Freemasonry movement, which began around the 1730s, of which Benjamin Franklin was an early advocate, was influenced very heavily by Jewish immigrants who had come to North America, the first being Etienne Stephen Morin, who'd come from France. He settled in the West Indies and had come with a mandate to open lodges of Freemasonry in North America, and had brought with him his understanding both of Freemasonry but also of his Jewish background. We also have Moses Michael Hayes, who might be more well known here. He was from Massachusetts, was probably the most important Freemason in this area, and set up lodges both in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And also famously, Moses Seixas from Rhode Island, who was famously the individual who welcomed George Washington to the synagogue, the Torah synagogue in Rhode Island, and of which an exchange of letters then occurred between Washington and Rabbi Seixas, suggesting that there should be no bigotry or persecution of Jews in North America. So we asked the question, how did Benjamin Franklin come to know of these virtues, and in what way maybe did Freemasonry have an influence upon him in creating these lists of virtues? Now, we do know that there was a very strong relationship between one Freemason and Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin knew Solomon Bush. He was the highest-ranking Jewish American in the American Revolutionary Army, and he was the Deputy Inspector General of Masonry for Pennsylvania, and very importantly, in 1781, involved in the lodge in which Benjamin Franklin was also involved. However, he died in destitute circumstances, and we know that Benjamin Franklin ordered that a pension be paid to him for his service during the Revolutionary War. So the final question that we may ask is, did the virtues that derive from the book of Proverbs, of which King Solomon is thought to be the traditional author, of which Freemasonry looks to King Solomon as their legendary founder, did the virtues influence the Freemasonry movements that brought those ideas to Benjamin Franklin, who then created a method for moral improvement on a daily basis, which was then copied by Rabbi Lefin for the impoverished community of Eastern Europe, which then became a method used today in the Jewish community called Mussar. Whether those connections are explicit or not, and whether they are apparent, there is certainly kind of an open secret, certainly in the Jewish community, that these things are part of our history, but they continue to be somewhat ambiguous and mysterious in how these connections came to be made. Thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of our time, but I'll be here if anybody wants to ask any questions, or if there are any questions now. Yes.